Welcome, everybody. Um, Welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm so glad you could be here for tonight's program, Art Deco Centennial, a guide to the Jazz Age style in our neighborhoods, city, and the world. I will be your presenter tonight, Andrew Berman. I'm the Executive Director of Village Preservation. I'm so thrilled and thankful for our co-sponsors, the East Village Community Coalition, the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, and the Art Deco Society of New York. All of their links are going to be dropped in the chat. So you'll be able to find out more about each of them. I know the Art Deco Society of New York has some upcoming programs that might be of interest to you, particularly in relation to our neighborhood, Greenwich Village. So certainly learn more about them. And I'd also encourage you to learn more about us, Village Preservation. We were founded in 1980, and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We have secured landmark designation of more than 1,300 buildings in our neighborhoods and host more than 80 free programs a year. Just go to our website to find out about more of them like this one. And we'd also strongly encourage you to consider making a donation or becoming a member. We basically live on support from the public, from folks like you. So your generosity and support are very much welcome, and you make everything that we do possible. So, without further ado, let's jump in. And first, just in terms of framing, and by the way, William will have dropped a link in the chat to find out more about Village Preservation and to join or make a donation. So please click on that link. And I want to just make sure that everybody's aware that tonight's program is being done concurrently with the release of our map, our interactive story map pictured here, A Century of Art Deco, which also celebrates the Centennial. A lot of what you'll see tonight is taken from the map, although there's much more in the map that we won't be able to get to in just our hour-and-a-half program tonight. So certainly explore it further. William will drop a link to the map in the chat. So please check it out. It's already gotten thousands of views. We'd love for it to get some more. It's really a great guide to Art Deco in general, and particularly in our neighborhoods, Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. And that is really just one of several maps that Village Preservation provides to learn more about the history and culture of our neighborhoods. Here are just a few other examples of some of the maps that you can find on our website. We cover everything from the history of hip hop to women's suffrage. A recent map and program was about French Flats, which sort of transformed living in New York City, women's suffrage, a whole range of wonderful, wonderful topics to explore. So kicking off tonight's program and our reason for having it, this year, of course, is the 100th anniversary in many ways of Art Deco. The streamlined Jazz Age architectural style derives its name from the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. Please forgive my terrible French accent, or the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Art, which opened in Paris on April 28th, 1925. Inextricably linked with the 1920s and 30s, Art Deco was defined by molded masses and geometric forms, bold, sharp colors, kinetic lines and edges, bas relief, and the utilization of industrial elements. Whoops. Oh. I think my screen share just disappeared. Hold on. William, I'm not seeing my screen share. Are you seeing it?
I can see it here on this end.
Huh. I can't see it, which makes it a little hard for me to... You know what? Pardon me, folks. I'm going to stop my screen share and then just start it again. I think that'll solve the problem. Yep, here we go. I'll assume you're seeing this unless I hear otherwise. All right. So moving forward, so here are some images of those buildings from the 1925 Paris Exposition, which really helped gel and put together, certainly in the public minds, the idea of this Art Deco design, what it meant, which really kind of crystallized several design threads that were moving through the culture in the mid-1920s and came to sort of really dominate through that decade and the decade that followed. But of course, it didn't all just start out of thin air at this 1925 Paris Exposition. It was an aesthetic that arguably manifested in various works well before the 1925 Paris Fair, drawing upon earlier styles such as Secessionism, Art Nouveau, and Aztec, Assyrian, and Egyptian architecture, as well as modernism, cubism, and fauvism. But the 1925 Exposition really crystallized the emerging design sensibility and broadcast it to the world to great effect. The use of the term Art Deco to define the style did not actually occur until 1966, when Deco was experiencing a revival after having fallen out of favor in the post-World War II years. Naming it thus, Art Deco, forever linked it to the 1925 Exposition, from which its name comes, and marked that pivotal event as the design's seminal moment. So let's take a look at some of these inspirations. Here we have Viennese Secession. This is the Vienna Secession Building of 1898. Joseph Maria Albrecht with paintings and murals by Gustav Klimt. You can see many, many through lines from this to Art Deco. In fact, I've walked around Vienna with people who love and appreciate architecture, but don't necessarily have an architectural history background, and they've seen buildings like this and said, "Oh, what a beautiful Art Deco building," because they know Art Deco, but they might not know Secession. But among other elements, the sort of flattening of perspective, with this deepening of the rich colors and two-dimensional bas-relief or other mosaics on the surface of the buildings. We see that in Secessionist architecture, and certainly it came to be an important part of Art Deco architecture. Another big influence, of course, was Art Nouveau, approximately 1890 to 1910. Here's just a few prominent examples of that style, which many people consider Secession to be a sort of a subset of. But among the elements that you see here is, first of all, the incredibly vivid use of color in some cases, as well as this contrast between what are often these very flat, planar surfaces, with then this contrasting with this very, very rich tapestry of ornament on top of it, though sometimes the ornament has been flattened out rather than in a true perspectival scale. And then, of course, there's the contemporary design style of Bauhaus and De Stijl, which emerged just in the late teens and certainly became very prominent in the 1920s. Here are just two very prominent examples of them. And sorry, if you sort of superimpose a Bauhaus or a De Stijl building on top of a Secession or an Art Nouveau building, or you sort of merge them and have their child, you really come up with Art Deco. These elements from these modernist buildings of the casement windows, the sharp geometric lines, the asymmetry, these are all elements that these two modernist styles introduced. Art Deco took pieces of it, combined it with these other design threads, and they weren't just these pre-existing Western design threads, but also non-Western ones. And one of the very interesting things about Deco is it allowed for regional variation. So in, for instance, the Americas, you often see Art Deco that draws on Mayan architecture, as pictured here, or Aztec architecture. Which, like the styles I showed before, also involve a use of two-dimensionality in a way that is different than traditional Western architectural approaches. This is not Renaissance architecture. There isn't a vanishing point. There isn't an attempt to make as true a perspective as possible. It's much more representational, and you certainly see that in Art Deco as well. Some other influences like that include Assyrian and certainly many other types of non-Western architecture. I do want to just mention briefly, by the way, we will have a Q&A at the end. So you may want to hold your questions until we get towards the end, because you might have a question that ends up being answered. Do drop it into the Q&A. That's where I will look for your questions. And I'll also mention the program in its entirety should run an hour and a half, give or take. My presentation will run about an hour or so, give or take, and that should leave a good bit of time for questions. So some of the other influences were non-architectural ones: Cubism, Fauvism, the way in which color was used here, as well as the flattening of perspective that you saw in Cubism, the desire to be able to look at an object from multiple perspectives at once. You certainly see that reflected in the way that Art Deco is presented. And these are just some examples of Art Deco works across the United States that clearly draw on some of these influences. This is 450 Sutter Street in San Francisco with what are clearly Mayan details. This is the great Cincinnati Union Terminal, which looks like it's inspired by an ancient Babylonian or Assyrian or Egyptian monument. And here's the General Electric building right here in New York City. This is a case where they're actually drawing on Gothic and medieval models as part of the design aesthetic. And that's because Gothic and medieval architecture, like these non-Western styles, also had this flattened perspective, was more representational, and Art Deco certainly leaned heavily on that. So in the tumultuous interwar years, a period of boom and bust, hope and despair, revolution and retrenchment, Art Deco represented a popular embrace of the new possibilities of the era. Its use of modern materials and non-traditional forms and inclusion of Eastern and pre-Columbian architectural styles and references presented a break from the past and a broadening of cultural perspective. But it also eschewed the austere and cerebral aesthetic of its contemporaneous architectural style, modernism, which preached immutable truths with universal applications. Deco, by contrast, allowed for regional variation and prioritized aesthetic pleasure and sensual stimulation over ideology or transparency. So now we're going to shift focus to Art Deco in New York. And as New York boomed in the 1920s and even during the Depression years of the 1930s, Art Deco left an indelible mark on the city. Residential neighborhoods in every borough and across the rapidly changing skyline bore its mark. And just as some examples of that, this is the downtown skyline in the 1930s. Over here is 70 Pine Street. Here's the Farmers Trust Building, 1 Wall Street. From the early 1930s until 1960, 6 of the 9 tallest buildings in New York City were all Art Deco skyscrapers. And here, looking at Midtown, I'll also mention that from the early 1930s until 1973, when the World Trade Center opened, and again from 2001 until 2007, after the World Trade Center was destroyed, the 3 tallest buildings in New York City were all Art Deco skyscrapers. So if you looked up in New York, you saw a lot of Art Deco, and it was clearly a defining architectural style for the city. But it wasn't just the height of the buildings. These were landmarks of the style in terms of the aesthetic. The Chrysler Building, perhaps the exemplar, which used everything from modern materials like stainless steel and famously used the figures from the cars that the company manufactured to, as you can see here with the elevator, inspirations from African, Eastern, and other types of art. So really an incredibly eclectic mix of influences from the modern to the past, West, East, that were combined with Art Deco. Empire State Building, another example of that, may be famous for being tall, but it should be just as famous for being a great work of architecture and certainly utilizing these Art Deco elements everywhere from the lobby to the entrance to the very top of the building. Rockefeller Center and Radio City Music Hall, an Art Deco city within a city built in the 1930s. And it wasn't just office buildings. Here we have some of the great hotels of New York City of this era, the Waldorf Astoria on the left, the New Yorker Hotel on the right. And by the way, that golden doorway for a long gone bank from the base of the building is actually still there. So if you're ever at the intersection of 34th Street and 8th Avenue, do yourself a favor, make sure you take a look at that. It's on the exterior of the building at the ground floor. It's simply mind-blowing and amazing. We also see the style manifesting in many other kinds of buildings, everything from the Marine Air Terminal at LaGuardia Airport to the Brooklyn Public Library, though arguably these buildings are more modern than Deco, and we'll talk a little bit about those distinctions shortly. But Art Deco's footprint in New York City was incredibly, incredibly broad. And I want to sort of quantify that a little bit, looking at what was happening in New York in the 1920s and 1930s up until the start of World War II. Not every building built during this time period was Art Deco by any means, but a significant percentage of them were. And certainly virtually every Art Deco building in New York was built during this time period. So first of all, during that time, New York built over 1.2 million units of housing as its population rose by nearly 1/3. And housing from this era accounts for about 30% of New York City's existing housing. Now, this map only shows 1920 to 1933. It's just what I was able to find. And certainly you don't see a lot of Art Deco in New York City in houses, whether it's single family, two family, four family. Not never, but it's relatively rare. But certainly where you have multi-unit apartment buildings, Art Deco starts to become much more common in some areas of New York, very common. And so some of the parts of the city that we most associate with Deco, you can see here in terms of these concentrations of construction during this era. That includes Central Park West and West End Avenue, Washington Heights here, quite famously the West Bronx and the Grand Concourse corridor right up to here, Mosholu Parkway, Pelham Parkway, and Bronx Park East here in the Bronx. You see a good bit of Deco in places like Astoria and Sunnyside before you get kind of farther out where it tends to be more the construction is more the form of houses, which are less likely to be Deco. And certainly in Brooklyn, places like Ocean Parkway, which is here, Ocean Avenue, which is here, Empire Boulevard over here, you see, and Kings Highway over here, you see a lot of the city's great Art Deco monuments, which we'll take a little bit of a closer look at. Of course, one of the most prominent examples in terms of residential architecture are Central Park West's twin-towered apartment buildings. 3 of the 4 of them are Art Deco. The only exception not shown here is the San Remo, which is a little bit more of a neo-Renaissance, neoclassical style. Of course, extremely pervasive in the Bronx, especially on or near the Grand Concourse. Here we have the famous and still extant, and if you've never visited it, you should. You typically can get into the lobby, 880 Grand Concourse at 888, I'm sorry, it's a typo, Grand Concourse at 161st Street, as well as 1150 Grand Concourse. We'll see more of each of these buildings. I'll mention I myself was born and lived the first year and a half of my life just a couple of blocks south of here in number 750 Grand Concourse. Here are the Park Plaza apartments just a little further west, still very much extant, still beautiful, beautiful buildings designed by Horace Ginsburg, who we'll hear a little bit more about. Ocean Parkway, another great center of Art Deco architecture, certainly Washington Heights as well, a plethora of residential Art Deco architecture. But now I want to focus in on, and the rest of the lecture will really look at Art Deco in the Village. And throughout the 20s and 30s, Greenwich Village and the East Village buzzed with jazz, flappers, and new development. But interestingly, and this is one of the things we found in our research putting together this map, Art Deco architecture's, footprint here was broad but less pervasive than one might have expected from neighborhoods like these. I think that if you didn't know these neighborhoods, and I can see from who's on the call that probably quite a few of you don't, given what the Village was about as a place of jazz speakeasies, this sort of carefree, freewheeling lifestyle, sort of embracing the latest innovations, a kind of artsy bohemian neighborhood. You would expect Art Deco to be incredibly pervasive. Interestingly, it has a much more modest presence, and we'll sort of talk about why a little bit. Part of that is because many buildings in the neighborhood were designed during this time with the aim of attracting artists. And the way in which they did that, and what is really sort of central to the village's identity, was by evoking the neighborhood's 18th and 19th century history. And therefore, a lot of these buildings during the 20s and 30s drew from 18th and 19th century architectural styles, or they adopted a Mediterranean look, which was seen as more directly at the time, at least in Greenwich Village, as evoking this bohemian or artistic flavor. And so just kind of some examples to illustrate this. On the upper left, we have the Mayor Jimmy Walker, who was the embodiment of Jazz Age New York. He grew up in, lived in throughout his mayoralty, Greenwich Village. He was a sort of a charismatic figure, but kind of a swindler. Betty Compton, the actress, she was his he was having a well-known affair with her. They eventually married, but she was really his mistress while he was mayor. He was known for living this sort of carefree jazz age lifestyle. We had Webster Hall that had these regular balls and bacchanals where people dressed, as you can see there. On the right, we have a flapper hanging a poster in Washington Square for some sort of gathering in the neighborhood. So certainly that aesthetic was pervasive in the neighborhood, but it didn't always manifest in the neighborhood's architecture. And part of the reason, as I said, was because of this kind of bohemian style that many architects tried to evoke at the time, as real estate developers were consciously trying to attract either artists or people who want to live around artists to the neighborhood. And one of the first examples of this is 6 to 24 East 8th Street, which is between 5th and University, a row of what had been 1820s row houses that were given this kind of Mediterranean overlay, interestingly, by Harvey Wiley Corbett, who became one of the great purveyors of Art Deco architecture. But here in 1916, he was doing this kind of Mediterranean bohemian overlay. And here's some other examples. These were all at the height of the Art Deco era, 1927, 1928. These were pre-existing buildings that were given these sort of bohemian Mediterranean makeovers meant to sort of imply this is where artists live, this is where people live, a sort of carefree, slightly raffish, but incredibly enjoyable lifestyle. Now, it wasn't just, however, in old buildings that were being altered, although here's a few other examples of that, also again from the late 1920s, but it was also in new architecture that you saw some of the architects and developers shying away from Art Deco. Don't worry, there's plenty of examples of Art Deco that we will get to, but I think this is important context to give. So these are a few prominent interwar apartment buildings in the neighborhood, in many cases designed by architects who did do quite a bit of Art Deco, even in this neighborhood. But as I said, in many cases, they looked to try to either evoke the earlier history of the neighborhood, back when it was a village, the sort of earlier days of the city and even of the country, because that sort of quaint charm was part of the neighborhood's appeal. The other piece of it is that Greenwich Village at this time period was really an unusual and unique mix of sort of old money wealth that never really left a small segment of the neighborhood on the north side of Washington Square, along the Fifth Avenue corridor, and then a vast array of people of widely varied socioeconomic means, ethnic backgrounds, lifestyles, etc., who lived in the neighborhood. And that was unusual. Typically, when the well-to-do moved out, they moved out almost entirely, and it became a whole new kind of neighborhood. The village continued to sort of hold on to a little of its older, original upscale residents and their descendants, even as it welcomed in immigrants, including fairly poor immigrants to working class, as well as new middle class arrivals. And part of the message from this architecture was to say, you may be living in this varied neighborhood, but these are buildings that are designed for the gentry, for the patricians, for the well-to-do in the neighborhood. And that was a sort of signal that sometimes the architecture was trying to send. But as I said, nevertheless, Greenwich Village and the East Village during this era saw a broad and varied range of notable Art Deco designs, which we're now going to dive into, as well as those in its related successor style, Art Moderne, which in a similar way derives its name from the 1937 Paris Exposition. I'm just going to call it the International Exposition of Art and Technology and Modern Life. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Moderne varies primarily from Art Deco in its greater emphasis on rounded, streamlined forms. But it's easy to sort of confuse or merge the two. Some of the most prominent Art Deco architects of the day designed buildings in these neighborhoods, from glamorous high-rises to workaday utilitarian structures. And several key figures who shaped Art Deco also lived in or were closely tied to these neighborhoods. So let's dive in. So we're going to go through several categories of buildings in the neighborhood and look at some prime examples of them. So the first one is what I call the skyline shapers. And the most prominent example of that is 1 Fifth Avenue from 1926, designed by Harvey Wiley Corbett, as I described earlier, characterized by chamfered corners, vertical streamline accents, staggered setbacks. It's one of the most prominent Art Deco landmarks, not only in Greenwich Village, but in the entire city. As I mentioned before, Corbett became quite famous for his Art Deco designs. This, by the way, was originally a residential hotel, but it was eventually converted to residences, and it remains that to this day. And you can see it, it was an even more prominent landmark when it was built in 1930, when it was built, pictured here in 1930, a few years later, really just kind of towering over Washington Square, and really in many ways sort of exemplifying the sumptuous massing of many Art Deco buildings. Now, moving across town to the East Village, we also have the most prominent skyline maker in that neighborhood, is also an arguably Art Deco building, similarly sited next to the main park of that neighborhood, which is Tompkins Square Park, a very different kind of building in some ways, at least in terms of its origins. One could argue today not so different, but this is the Christodora House, built in 1928, which was constructed as a settlement house for low-income and immigrant residents, and it provided food, shelter, and educational and health services. It was intended to care for the physical, social, intellectual, and spiritual development of the people in the crowded portions of the city of New York. Those of you who are not familiar, settlement houses were set up to serve immigrants, to offer them services, but also to help turn them into Americans, to get them settled in this country. Christodora House also launched the career of social reformer Harry Lloyd Hopkins, who was an advisor to Franklin D. Roosevelt and an architect of the New Deal programs, appropriately enough. And here's some early images of the building. Certainly much more spare and Spartan, I think appropriately so, than a lot of other Art Deco buildings, and arguably Art Deco-ish as opposed to a strictly Art Deco building, but certainly the masses, the verticality, the bas-relief ornament show the Art Deco influences, and you can see that around the entrance here as well. Our last skyline maker, 56 7th Avenue, was designed by the Italian-born architect Rosario Candela, who really helped define pre-World War II luxury New York City apartments, known for setbacks and penthouses. His 56 7th Avenue, located just south of 14th Street, now known as the Candela Tower, features significant signature rooftop terraces and a central water tower that elegantly crowns its symmetrical facade. Here's a close-up of that tower, a look at the building in profile, which really, or sort of semi-profile, which really rises prominently over that stretch there. Here's an image of a rendering of the building from an initial brochure and a layout of one of those penthouse apartments, which really shows how Candela innovated and sort of created the modern penthouse apartment with everything organized around a central foyer and a series of sort of setback rooms fronting onto terraces. Now, the facade's visual depth really comes from its protruding brick piers, a limestone excuse me, storefront base, and simple cornice anchors. The recessed entrance, framed by fluted limestone pilasters, is topped by a metal canopy with deco details, which you can see here, and a second floor window with a terracotta surround and Juliet balcony with ornate metal work. So now we're going to move from those skyline elements to just sort of a notch below that, at least in terms of height, and some upscale apartment towers in the neighborhood. We're going to start with the most deco of them all, which is 14 Washington Place, just east of Washington Square, designed by the noted firm of Schwartz and Gross, notable for Art Deco landmarks like 55 Central Park West. Number 14 was once the home to Mayor Ed Koch and features cream and brown brick, which is very common in New York Art Deco buildings, chamfered upper corners, and decorative spandrels and setbacks. Its flattened triangular ornaments near the top nod to secessionist and Aztec or Mayan influences, adding rhythm to the otherwise very flat facade. And I think one of the things that's most impressive about this building, if you look at it, it's actually more or less a box up until the just the 3 or 4 top floors, when there's a bit of chamfering that goes on. But there's this very, very rich bas-relief detail and this great variation in terms of the brickwork, color, etc., that gives the building a really pretty marvelous kinetic energy that makes it so much more interesting than you would think just a boxy large building like that would be. And here's 55 Central Park West, which is probably Schwartz and Gross's most well-known Art Deco landmark. Here we have another very deco-y high-rise in the neighborhood, which is known as the Gansevoort. And it's one of H.I. Feldman, who was a very prolific Art Deco architect's designs, a 16-story apartment house that really shows Art Deco's tendency for blocky forms and staggered setbacks, as well as contrasting horizontal and vertical accents, which give this boxy building a sense of energy and movement. So like the other building, if you sort of just looked at it in terms of its massing, it wouldn't necessarily seem like the most dynamic building, but because of the way in which there are these setbacks, the contrasting brickwork, the horizontal and vertical accents, it becomes a much more dynamic building. And if you look at the ground floor, there's this lovely bas-relief ornament around the entrance and the service doorways. Now, Feldman's worth commenting on. In his at the time of his death in 1981, the New York Times described him as an architect who designed 2,500 apartment houses in the New York metropolitan area. Established his practice in 1921 and became particularly active on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, where his buildings are examples of the Art Deco style, and in Brooklyn. His projects ranged from Greenwich Village to Murray Hill to Yorkville, and his hallmarks were corners beveled at 45-degree angles at the setback upper stories. This is not the last you'll see of Feldman today. From here, I want to move east to the East Village, where we have another one of these sort of blocky Art Deco buildings where once you look at the ornament, it becomes much more dynamic. This is known as Egelof Towers. It's actually 2 apartment buildings that are conjoined. They cover an entire block front on Avenue A and 4th Street, and it really shows its Art Deco details primarily around its bas-relief adorned entryways, the sans serif lettering of the building's name around its entrances, and the flattened 2-dimensional ornamentation at the roof line and the lower floors. And here's some close-up details, sort of classic Art Deco entryway light. You can see, these are intended to sort of imply columns, even though they're really just bas-relief representations of columns. And you can see sort of in closer detail here, these lovely swirling patterned stone ornament, not quite two-dimensional, a little bit of relief to it, that really give the building its dynamism and counterpoints. But also the lobby, if you ever have a chance to go inside, is adorned with gold-painted bas-relief and marble, and it retains a considerable amount of its original Art Deco detail. The building reflects a brief period in the late 1920s when developers believed the neighborhood we now call the East Village might be ripe for more upscale development. Of course, the East Village went through sort of a really much rougher period in the mid to late 20th century, but of course is now again considered a very desirable place to live. Here are a few more of those details. Then we're going to move to one of the greatest names in early 20th century New York architecture and in Art Deco architecture in New York, Emery Roth, and this is his 59 West 12th Street. This 18-story pre-war high-rise blends Art Deco with traditional touches. And what you're going to see here with a lot of these upscale high-rises is they kind of hedge their bets. They're deco in some ways, but they're traditional in other ways. I think because they're trying to appeal to different kinds of people on different levels. The geometric detailing, the layered setbacks, and the bold massing mark its deco style, but the limestone, tan brick, coins, and double hug windows are nods to classic designs. And here's some close-ups that show you a little bit more of those details. One has to note when talking about Emery Roth that he designed many of New York's most iconic early 20th century buildings, including standout Art Deco works like the El Dorado pictured here and the Ardsley on Central Park West, the Normandy on Riverside Drive, and 888 Grand Concourse, all among the city's most striking deco landmarks. Here's 888 again, and to the left is the Normandy. Both of these are really arguably more modern rather than deco, strictly speaking, but it's kind of all in the family. Now we're going to take a sort of quick look at several other of these high rises. 3 of the 4 of them are designed by the firm of Boak and Paris. I hope I'm pronouncing the first of the 2 names correctly. They actually came out of the Emery Roth firm and in the late 1920s started their own firm, and their designs are very similar to his. And in a similar way, they use a combination of deco and traditional detailing in a lot of these buildings throughout the village. Again, sort of hedging their bets, appealing to modern sensibilities while at the same time conveying a hearkening back to sort of an earlier time, whether that's because you were attracted by quaintness or because that might have implied a sort of a higher class or a finer level of socioeconomic background. Whatever the reason, they sort of combine both of them. And if you look at the detail here, you can see some very, very typically deco kind of detailing, but against the, including this ironwork grill over here, but against a backdrop of this very earthen colored brick, often in Flemish bond patterns, so very traditional styles, double hung windows, 6/1, in some cases 6/6, kind of, so these deco and traditional elements really bumping right up against one another. Another Boak in Paris at 45 Christopher Street, you really see these same elements there, some very deco-y ornamentation, such as over here, but again, these sort of multi-pane, almost colonial style windows, and the sort of classical banding of the stone here, as well as these, excuse me, Flemish bond or English bond brickwork. This one's a little bit later, and if you kind of squinted or just looked at the black and white version of this, you might simply say, well, this is just a classic Art Deco building. But if you look closer at the details, whether it's the red and brown brick, or some of these other details here, like the urn over the doorway, the Grecian scroll motifs. These all sort of harken back to more traditional styles, even as the massing, the chamfered corners, these corner windows are very much Art Deco. And last but not least in this category, we have 2 Horatio Street, which in a similar way. So these are, I'm not really sure if these are kind of drawing on Native American ornamentation, which we definitely see in Deco sometimes, or if these are sort of blown up examples of scrolls that you sometimes see in Federal style or Greek Revival style architecture. The massing of the building is certainly much more typical of a Deco building, but you see again here this traditional brickwork and traditional windows. The entryway here, a little more in the Deco style, albeit with this sort of somewhat more subdued gray earthen marble. But here are those elements here, which look at it one way, seems to be Native American inspired. Look at it another way, it seems like a sort of almost a postmodern homage to early American federal or colonial architecture. So now we're going to move from these sort of grand upscale buildings to more middle-class apartment buildings. Interestingly, in these, they're much less unequivocal in their Art Deco design sensibilities, unlike the ones we were just looking at. 75 Bank Street here, or Abingdon Court, is a perfect example of that. Built in 1938, glazed brick bands, accented corners, courtyard entrance, stone and metal doorway. Really this is kind of a classic New York middle class Art Deco apartment building. You see it here as well, the chamfered corners. Even the fire escapes are done in this kind of streamlined cream color to contrast with the sort of more vivid orange brick. And then shifting to the east side, we have Horace Ginsburg, who I mentioned earlier. And this building on East 3rd Street between A and B, I believe, looks as though it might belong on the Bronx's Grand Concourse in Hudson Heights or along Brooklyn's Ocean Parkway. And that's both because its architect, Horace Ginsburg, designed some of the most notable Art Deco apartment houses in those neighborhoods, and because 176 East 3rd Street occupies an unusually expansive footprint for the otherwise very densely packed East Village, using 4 25 by 100-foot lots. Here's just a few more details that show the sort of powerful contrasting vertical and horizontal elements, the ironwork underneath the balconies, these sort of flattened geometric arches, all of which are very emblematic of the Art Deco style. Here's a few more details in close-up. And here as well. Now, the one thing that's a shame is that lost from the building is the projecting vertical ornamentation that once capped the central corner towers and the roof line between rows of windows, as can be seen in these historic photos. Those details, as well as much of the remaining ornament, drew loosely upon Aztec and Mayan inspirations. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon to see those protruding details lost in Art Deco buildings, particularly ones that are in areas where maybe they were less well maintained, which certainly the East Village went through that period. But these are just some examples of other works by Horace Ginsburg. The ones on top we saw before, the ones below are new, but this really just sort of speaks to what both a prolific and talented Art Deco architect he was. The 2 on top and Noonan Plaza are all in the Bronx. 135 West 225th Street is in Marble Hill, which you could either say is the Bronx or is Manhattan. This one over here is on the Upper West Side, which with this incredibly charming entrance. And then we have 22 Grove Street by H.I. Feldman, who we're gonna talk a little bit about Feldman, but this building really packs a lot of Art Deco into its modest 6-story frame. Tan, light, brown, and dark brown bands of brick alternate to add kinetic energy to the facade, while also implying shadows and depth on a mostly 2-dimensional facade. The real show occurs around the entryway, where flattened stoned scrolled forms contrast with a curving projecting balcony and boldly colored polychromy over the doorway. Similar motifs of contrasting color, materials, and forms can be found near the building's top, which you can see here. So again, these sort of more middle-class Art Deco apartment buildings, there's no shame in their Art Deco game. They are not trying to hide the fact that they are Deco buildings. Here's another really interesting one, 210 6th Avenue, which we were able to get landmarked in 2010 as part of the Sullivan-Thompson Historic District. It's unusual in a few ways. It's trapezoidally shaped, and it has this sort of almost pointed south face, which you can see here on the right, contrasting cream, orange, and brown brick, along with strong vertical projections. One of the things that I sort of admire about this building, and I've sort of brought it up in other cases, it's done a little bit uniquely here. So this is the long side along 6th Avenue, and it's basically a block, but the way that it has this sort of limestone trim, it makes it look as if it's three different buildings or buildings in three sections, to give the facade this energy. So you sort of, your eye goes like this, it goes up, it goes across, it comes back down. There's the horizontal elements, there's the vertical elements. And I just want to sort of show what the building looked like before it lost its casement windows, which really were an integral part of the design. And it's always a shame when we lose those. This is the final middle-class apartment building example, 2 Grove Street from 1938. A little more sort of restrained using that brown brick. And a little later, so it's got these modern elements here, this sort of curved marquee over the entryway with the sort of circular elements, these circular brick patterns around the entryway, as well as these curved, streamlined fire escapes, all of which are sort of a nod to the modern aesthetic. Now we're going to move from residential buildings onto some very striking institutional buildings in the neighborhood. Just 2 of them, but they're pretty powerful. The first one is the Salvation Army National and Territorial Headquarters on West 14th Street. Notable both for its architecture and the fact that it was designed by Ralph Walker. This is a classic design by Walker, featuring a dramatic molded auditorium entry, and as well as a Deco-style doorway and signage. The adjoining office structure with its vertical lines and geometric crown draw from Mayan and Aztec influences. Here's a sort of a little bit of a closer look at that. This really just sort of incredibly cavernous entryway on 14th Street is very, very striking, could sort of stop you dead in its tracks. Here's the sort of gilded ironwork for the gate from that entryway. So some really incredibly powerful elements there, none of which come as a surprise from Ralph Walker, who was a leading architect of the interwar period, who helped shape modern design by exploring the sculptural potential of New York's 1916 zoning laws. His Art Deco landmarks, like the Barclay Vesey building shown here and 1 Wall Street coming up, showcase bold, setback-driven forms made possible by post-World War I construction and zoning. So here's 1 Wall Street on its exterior. You can see these sort of incredibly sharp vertical fluted forms. Here's its crown, and this is its base, its interior at its base. It recently reopened as a department store. If you haven't gone, this is one of the most incredible public spaces in all of New York City. It still looks exactly like that from when it was a banking room. Check it out, 1 Wall Street at Broadway. And then the second institutional building, sort of at the a different end of the spectrum here, is the Cooper Station Post Office of 1936. Although arguably it could be described more aptly as WPA modern or classical revival, this post office really nevertheless reflects Art Deco's evolution. By the 30s, Deco in this country embraced rounded forms and classical or colonial elements, especially in WPA projects designed to convey government authority and American identity. And of course, in the 1930s, wasn't just in this country, but in many Western countries, this idea of portraying government power and the national identity became more and more apparent in architecture. The Cooper Station Post Office features a curving corner, fluted neoclassical columns, a three-dimensional eagle sculpture, and Roman-style lettering. Inside is a curving marble space, and it's part of Village Preservation's proposed south of Union Square Historic District, which would protect its historic features. Here's an image of the interior. So now we're going to look at a couple of commercial structures. This one here, located at Sheridan Square at 4th Street and 7th Avenue South, dates to 1932. Slightly altered, especially on the left side of the structure, but in wonderful shape in other parts of it. Really drips with Art Deco details. The pale yellow brick contrasts sharply with black brick and terracotta ornament, as well as light-colored terracotta detailing around the entryway and windows. The bas-reliefs draw on Aztec, classical, and maritime inspirations, which you can see here. Now, the architecture is not the only Art Deco element to this site. The structure replaced the Greenwich Village Theater, pictured here, which was the home of the Greenwich Village Follies, costumes for which were designed by the premier Art Deco designer Erte. And here's some images of his costume designs for the Greenwich Village Follies, which originally was performed at the theater on this site. Much later, and sort of a different kind of look, a little more art moderne. This is 69 Gansevoort Street, dates to 1949. The brick and aluminum late modern facade is one of the area's most striking storefronts. Bold raised lettering contrasts with a smooth aluminum framing, while vertical and horizontal elements create a dynamic balance. Many of you know it was the home of Florent Restaurant for several decades, and in 2003, Village Preservation was able to get it landmarked as part of the Gansevoort Market Historic District. Now let's look at some industrial buildings in the neighborhood in the Art Deco style, some of which are incredibly sort of bold in their use of Art Deco ornamentation and imagery. And we're going to start at the corner of 13th Street at Greenwich Avenue with this IND substation, which dates to 1930. It's got chamfered corners, step setbacks, vertical lines, geometric brickwork, Aztec-inspired bas-relief trim, and bold sans serif lettering. Etched deco patterns also appear on the large steel doors along 13th Street, which I'll give you a close-up of. But if you look at this deco ornament here, it's really pretty striking. The building could use a cleaning. It makes it a little hard to see some of that sometimes, but it is there, and it is really striking if you take a closer look at it. Here it is in the 1960s when it might have needed an even deeper clean, although that might be the black and white photography. But really a striking Art Deco, albeit utilitarian monument. Somewhat similar on the other side of our neighborhood in the East Village is the New York Telephone Building at 2nd Avenue and 12th Street, which is another work by the great Ralph Walker, that key interwar architect who's known for shaping New York City's Art Deco style. This one is clad in tan brick and features Walker's signature molded forms inspired by Mayan and Aztec motifs. Its vertical facades with fluting and spandrels contrast with a strong horizontal base, ending in striking light stone parapet caps. Here's some examples. Now, this is another building that has seen better days. I don't think it's been cleaned in years, including of lots of graffiti. But if you look past that and you see these elements, it's really classic Ralph Walker in a lot of ways. And then here's one that's a very workaday structure, but happens to be one of my favorites, 17 Leroy Street, 18 to 20 Morton Street, designed by Matthew Del Gaudio. It's a 3-story Art Deco parking garage with pale brick facades, flat and monochrome, but it really comes alive through bold vertical accents, horizontal industrial windows, and Aztec-inspired brick and stone details. The subtle surface shifts add depth and motion. We, Village Preservation, were able to get this landmarked in 2010 as part of the extension of the Greenwich Village Historic District. And, you know, here as well, part of what I find so striking is this building is basically a box with very subtle variations in the protrusion of the brickwork, a little bit of very flat bas-relief ornamentation. But if you look closely, there's really a lot going on here, contrasting up and down motion, vertical and horizontal, really just a powerful building. And Matthew Del Gaudio, he was quite the skilled architect, not just Art Deco garages. Just around the corner from here, he did Our Lady of Pompeii Church, also in 1926. In that case, he did not go the Art Deco route, but more of a neo-classical or Renaissance revival one. The one part of our neighborhood where virtually every building from the 1920s and 30s is in the Art Deco or modern style is the meatpacking district. Every building built during that time period reflects that aesthetic. And I just want to quickly show you some of those examples. This is the first one, 835 Washington Street. Simple, but really lovely, delightful two-story meatpacking plant. That dates to the 1920s. A decade later, directly to its north, is 837 Washington Street, and a little bit more of a modern style with that sort of curved awning. This is what it looks like today, or relatively recently, with the 5-story twisting addition set back behind it. Here's a little bit more of a sort of classic deco look to this building on the corner of Gansevoort and Greenwich Street, dates to 1938 to 39. Here it is in 1940. You can see, other than the removal of the overhead rail line and the cigarette ads, it looks pretty similar today to as it did 85 years ago. Now I want to look at just a couple of examples of renovations in the neighborhood that integrated deco into pre-existing buildings. Just two of them. The first one is 1618 Jane Street. This building always sort of stops me in my tracks when I'm on this block of Jane Street, just off of Greenwich Avenue. It really looks like it could be in Miami Beach. It's actually a pair of 1887 tenements that were altered in 1939 with these striking Art Deco or Art Moderne features. The facade was stuccoed in a light pastel blue, accented by royal blue iron fences, fire escapes, and a front door frame. Now, we could not find an image of what the building looked like before this alteration, but what I did gather is images of some buildings from twin tenements from 1887 that are of the same number of stories, same number of bays of windows, all within a block of this site. Actually, the one over here literally backs up onto 1618 Jane Street. So this is what 1618 Jane Street probably looked like before its transformation. So you can see it's a pretty dramatic change. And here's just some close-ups of some of those details, the sort of Aztec or Native American inspired ironwork here. It's a lovely sunburst around the doorway, this sort of classic Art Deco light. And even the fire escape, they decided they needed to make it fun. If you look, it's got these really amusing circular cutouts in this sort of royal blue painted pattern. So much more fun than your average renovated tenement. And here's just one other example where you don't really have to imagine as much what it looked like before its renovation, because above the second floor, this circa 1900 tenement looks somewhat like it did before. They clearly stripped it of some of its ornament, but in 1930, they did this to the ground floor here. Classic deco. If you just saw the ground floor, you would think that this was, a new upscale apartment building on West End Avenue or Central Park West. Deco horizontal accents, industrial casement windows, a geometric doorway with a semicircular handle and side lights, and the 55 address in classic Deco typography that you can see here. We've just got one or two more categories of buildings, and this is an interesting one. These are what I call non-deco landmarks, which we include on the map. There's just two of them, but they're on the map even though they are not themselves deco for good reason. One of them is 35 East 9th Street. Now, this was designed by Harvey Wiley Corbett, who is a noted Art Deco architect, but that's not the main reason why we put it on our Art Deco map, but just to make sure everybody has a full understanding of how significant of an Art Deco architect Corbett was. These are the master apartments at 310 Riverside Drive. And on the left are the New York City Criminal Courts building. And on the right is the MetLife North building. Now, on the far right is the building as it exists, an approximately 25-story building. In the middle, next to it, is a rendering of what was originally planned to be built here, which was a 100-story, 1,500-foot tall structure, of which the building, which was ultimately built, was only supposed to be the base of. And as you can see from this design by Corbett, this would have been not only one of the most striking buildings in all of New York, but the whole world, had it been built to its full intended height. Because of the Depression, it was scaled back dramatically, and even in the form in which it was built, it is a extremely striking building. But the real reason why 35 East 9th Street appears on our Art Deco tour is because architectural renderer Hugh Ferris lived here. He was a collaborator of Corbett's, as well as a lot of other architects of the time. And if you don't know Hugh Ferris, his 1922 Four Stages renderings and his visionary 1929 book, The Metropolis of Tomorrow, really shaped the Art Deco aesthetic of the time. His bold geometric style helped define Art Deco and influence landmarks like the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center. Here's the Four Stages, which shows what the new 1916 zoning resolution would lead to in terms of the design of buildings. And this is his 1929 Metropolis of Tomorrow. Some images from there, which, among other things, not only influenced real buildings that were built, or I should say permanent buildings, but temporary ones as well, like the 1933 Chicago World's Fair and the 1939 New York World's Fair. And then our second and last non-deco landmark is 144 Bleecker Street, where Maury's restaurant was located. These altered Federal row houses are key to deco history as an early 1920 work by Raymond Hood. Later, the architect of New York City deco landmarks like the Daily News Building, Rockefeller Center, the American Radiator Building. Hood also lived here. The design obviously is colonial revival, not a deco, but this was Hood's very, very first commission when he was a young, unknown architect. As I mentioned, the ground floor once housed Maury's, a restaurant owned by Placido Maury, who hired Raymond Hood for the 1920 redesign. Maury's became a hub for artists and architects, including deco greats like Eli Jacques Kahn and Joseph Urban, as well as Hood, who lived upstairs and got cheap meals below. Village Preservation was able to get the building landmarked in 2013 as part of the South Village Historic District. So these are some of the other great deco works by Hood, Daily News, McGraw-Hill, American Radiator, arguably more of a sort of precursor to deco, depends on who you ask. Rockefeller Center, the Beaux-Arts apartments, which in spite of their name are as hardcore in their Art Deco, I think, as you can get. If you've never visited these buildings, which face each other on either side of 44th Street on the east side, I urge you to. It's really an incredible experience to see these two powerful, almost monolithic Art Deco buildings sort of enveloping you on either side. And then we have some deco works by Eli Jacques Kahn, who, as I mentioned, was one of the people who, along with Hood, sort of had a second home at Maury's restaurant downstairs. This is 2 Park Avenue, 261 Fifth Avenue, Art Deco classics. And here we have Joseph Urban, the New School Auditorium, the Reinhardt Theater, never built, but proposed, a striking deco design, the Ziegfeld Theater, which was demolished, and his Hearst magazine building, which is still there, although it now has a 50-story glass skyscraper on top of it. And then the final section is just a couple of no longer with us Art Deco landmarks. The very first one is number 10 Greenwich Avenue, the Women's House of Detention, built in 1931. This massive structure was the only known Art Deco women's prison, housing figures like Ethel Rosenberg and Angela Davis. Though designed with reform in mind, its oppressive design, narrow windows, stark massing, and a lack of deco flair made it deeply unpopular. It was closed in 1971 after public outcry and demolished and replaced by the Jefferson Market Garden, which is there now. You sometimes have to look closely at the building to recognize that it was Deco, but there's very, very few Deco buildings that really look like this or are so kind of overwhelming and oppressive in their style and their massing. These two images, which I pulled particularly because you can actually see the little bit of the deco ornament that did exist to a certain degree, but it's really, it's not enough to sort of save this building from this massive, just overwhelmingly oppressive presence, combined with the purpose that it served, which everybody from every end of the political and ideological spectrum hated this building and what it did. So it was in fact demolished in the early 1970s. I'm much more sad to talk about the loss of the tunnel garage built in 1922 and demolished in 2006. It was built 3 years before the 1925 Paris Exposition. The tunnel garage embodied early Art Deco with its bold design and details. Named for the nearby Holland Tunnel, it featured a terracotta medallion of a Model T emerging from the tunnel, a striking bit of architectural advertising to attract drivers, who were a new breed, of course, in that day. Now, here it is in 1923. By 1940, you can see that sort of glass corner is already bricked up, unfortunately. And in later years, it was very, very, very poorly taken care of. But here it is just before demolition, where you can actually see the medallion, which had been covered up for years in color, showing that Model T emerging from the not yet built Holland Tunnel. The Holland Tunnel didn't open until the late 1920s, but it was under construction. Here's a sort of a little bit of a closer up detail. You can see some of that, some of the lettering, the graphic design there. With its industrial casement windows, colorful terracotta, geometric detailing, and bold lettering, the tunnel garage showcased Art Deco before the style even had a name. Despite village preservation efforts, the city denied the building landmark status, and it was demolished in 2006. A decade later, the site was included in a historic district, but unfortunately it was, which we pushed for, but it was too late to save the building. And then our very last stop on the tour, and then I'll wrap up for Q&A. And just a reminder, drop your questions in the Q&A. That's Q&A rather. That's where I will be looking for them. This was originally the Coleman Diner at 357 West Street. I believe the cross street was what would that be? More around Morton Street. It was below Christopher, but above Houston, about halfway in between. It dated to approximately the late 1940s. A really, really, really incredibly charming Art Deco diner, not what you associate with Greenwich Village, right on West Street. When it was built, it would have been underneath or facing the elevated West Side Highway, but really some incredibly sweet, charming features here. It went through many, many different iterations over the year. It closed in 2006. It sat there empty, empty in that it wasn't occupied by a business. It was broken into and clearly used by others for about 8 years before it was finally demolished in 2014. Here's what it looked like in 1991 when, for whatever reason, it was kind of this light pink, but here it is with these sort of green and light green and dark green bands. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much, everybody. We will now go to the Q&A. So again, Q&A, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. And William, I'm not seeing the Q&A here. Q&A, should I just be looking in the chat then? Did I make a mistake?
No, it might be because It's a little annoying. The bottom bar changes when you have your screen share on.
Oh, okay. Let me stop share, and then that should hopefully allow me to see the Q&A. I don't know why I keep saying, yep, here we go. I see the Q&A.
Okay.
All right. So now I can get into the Q&A, folks. So I'm going to look for some questions. Did people object to 1 Fifth Avenue overshadowing Washington Square Park? It's a very good question. You would think in Greenwich Village that they would have. What I can say is I can neither confirm nor deny that that is the case. I haven't come across anything that points to people saying that. I know that for 2 Fifth Avenue across the street, which was built in the early 1950s, there were definitely some very, very strong protests. And as a result, the mass of the building was pushed back from Washington Square Park. It was originally supposed to be on Washington Square North. The ultimate formulation of it was they built these sort of faux townhouses along Washington Square North with 2 Fifth Avenue set a little further back behind it. Keep in mind, 1 Fifth Avenue is not only not directly on the park, but it's actually behind Washington Square Mews, so a little further separated. So that may have been one reason why there was less of an outcry. But again, I can't tell you for sure that that there was not an outcry against it. Another question about whether or not there was opposition to the construction of the building. Could you talk about the Williamsburg Savings Bank Tower near BAM, now also known as One Hanson Place? Certainly a building I'm familiar with, not in my presentation. Another building that arguably certainly has some, excuse me, Art Deco influences and elements to it. A little bit more of the kind of neo-Byzantine. It's got that sort of rounded top that is sort of really derived from Byzantine models. For many, many years, the tallest building in Brooklyn. It's now been overshadowed by about a dozen taller buildings in downtown Brooklyn, but certainly one of the most striking landmarks in that borough and in New York City. Let's see. Then I have a question. Oh, that's interesting. A lot of times the same question being asked by multiple people. Was the medallion of the tunnel garage saved? Yes, but with a real asterisk connected to it. So when the building was demolished, the developer did quote unquote save the medallion with the idea that it would be added to the new building that was built on the site, a 6-story condo building. They did add it to the very top of the building, but as you could see from the presentation, the medallion was curved because the building was curved on the curved side. And the new building that the medallion was sort of tacked onto the setback top of is not curved. So it didn't fit. So it was like basically like sort of having to flatten out an orange peel. So there were spaces between the various sections. So it really looks terrible. And because it's on the setback top of the building, as opposed to where it was on the tunnel garage, which was on the facade that faced the street, if you were standing in front of the building, you couldn't see it. You have to be standing about a block away from it, far enough back to be able to see it. And then it's there. But it does not look like it originally did because of this splintering that needed to take place in order to make it fit on a flat surface, unfortunately. So somebody asked, could you explain some of the differences between Beaux-Arts style and Art Deco? Well, they couldn't be more different. It would probably be an entire program to talk about the differences between them. Those buildings that I showed that are referred to as the Beaux-Arts apartments, they're called the Beaux-Arts apartments because they are directly adjacent to the Beaux-Arts Institute, which is on that block, which interestingly is like the Beaux-Arts apartments, not designed in a Beaux-Arts style, but is in fact like the Beaux-Arts apartments, designed in a very Art Deco style. So Beaux-Arts really draws on classical models. It was very popular in the late 19th and early 20th century in America. So it would look completely different. You would not have these, sort of flattened perspectives, these two-dimensional. Beaux-Arts is the New York Public Library main branch, Grand Central Terminal, the old Penn Station. Those are Beaux-Arts buildings. But of course, the term Art Deco didn't exist at the time, so they couldn't have called that building, those two buildings, the Art Deco apartments. It didn't exist. They called it the Beaux-Arts apartments, I believe, because of its connection to and proximity to the Beaux-Arts Institute, which is also on that block, also a beautiful building. Thank you for the very nice comments that I see in here. Did the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and interest in ancient Egypt influence Art Deco? Absolutely. One of many things that did. We see several periods in architectural history when a fascination with Egypt permeates new architectural styles. You see it in the sort of mid-19th century in terms of the kind of romantic designs where buildings were often designed to sort of look like they were ancient ruins. And certainly the 1922 King Tut's tomb discovery also got people focused on that. We don't really have much of any Art Deco or other architecture in New York that directly shows that sort of Egyptian influence. There's other places where it certainly does, but that's one of the many ones, many influences of the time. Let's see. More questions about, was the non-deco intro slide by Ferris? The non-deco, yes, I understand what you mean. Where I said the non-deco deco landmarks, that is from Hugh Ferris's The Metropolis of Tomorrow. Thank you. Is this presentation online? Someone asked. Well, this entire program, which is being taped, will be appear on our YouTube page. It will appear on our website, and everybody who registered for the program will get a link to the video sent to them. So Laura Lubin asks, what about other William Walker buildings in Lower Manhattan, several of which were either I think you mean Ralph Walker, several of which were either AT&T or Verizon buildings. Yes, there's an incredible array of Ralph Walker, AT&T, Verizon, New York Telephone buildings throughout New York. Could do an entire program just on those. This is the one that we happen to have in our neighborhood, and so it's included in the tour and the program. But one of Ralph Walker's great talents was these utilitarian buildings that he designed for Bell Telephone or New York Telephone that you can see in places like Tribeca, Chelsea. There's one here in Hell's Kitchen. They're really pretty amazing. Let's see. I see before the name Art Deco began to be used, I called the style Industrial Gothic. Now I see that Art Moderne could be called Industrial Romanesque. Interesting. We'll see if that catches on. What is the general occupancy rate of these apartment and commercial buildings? I don't have statistics on that, but I can certainly say that in New York, I believe Art Deco architecture still really captures the public's imagination. And some of our city's most desirable pre-war apartment buildings are Art Deco buildings. I showed you those three Central Park West buildings. There's many other ones. In the West Bronx and South Bronx, which are neighborhoods that fell on very, very, very hard times and still struggle a bit. Those great Art Deco buildings, while some of them were abandoned and lost in the 1970s and 1980s, some of them stayed among the very, very few sort of relatively stable, relatively well managed and maintained buildings in those neighborhoods that were struggling with abandonment and arson and crime. And certainly a lot of those commercial buildings, Art Deco buildings, are quite desirable. The Waldorf Astoria, for better or worse, was just converted in large measure, I think not entirely, to residences. So people clearly still very much want Art Deco. So let's see what else we have here. Is Moroccan detailing considered deco? Well, I think it really depends on the case. You can certainly see Moroccan, Middle Eastern, other kinds of ornament or detail in some integrated into a deco building. One of the interesting things about deco is you could sort of do a deco version of almost anything. You sort of flatten the perspective, you emphasize the geometries. So certainly there are examples where I think there are things that you could describe as Moroccan detailing, where it's a deco building, but I wouldn't say that Moroccan detailing, I'm sorry, in and of itself makes a building deco. Are the interiors included in a landmark designation? Only in very, very rare cases. So in New York City, the way the law works is we do have things called interior landmarks. You can only landmark an interior when it's a space which is customarily open to the public. So in other words, lobbies of these apartment buildings, and by the way, some of the lobbies of these apartment buildings, if you ever walk past an Art Deco apartment building, at the very least, look through the doors at the lobby. And if you're able to go inside, do it. I spent a couple of years of my life where I just walked around the Bronx, where I'm from, and went into the lobbies of Art Deco buildings, and one was more spectacular than the next. So, but landmarking can't apply to the lobby of a residential building, can only apply to a space in New York, I should say, that's customarily open to the public. So for instance, the Rainbow Room at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, which is a restaurant, that is an interior landmark, so that is preserved, but most of these interior spaces are not. I see somebody mentioning the McGraw-Hill building. There was a fight to try to get the lobby of the McGraw-Hill building landmarked because it could have qualified for landmark designation because it was a sort of a space that was open to the public as a lobby of an office building. But unfortunately, that effort failed, and a lot of that really incredible space was destroyed. The exterior of that building is landmarked. What about Art Deco in Queens? Yes, there's a whole huge array of Art Deco in Queens. Obviously, there's in general, a ton of Queens was built in the 1920s and 30s, most of it not in the Art Deco style, because as I said, single, two-family, and four-family houses very rarely are in that style, but there's some wonderful Art Deco in Queens. I think I mentioned Astoria and Sunnyside as being two places where you would see that. There's definitely some, particularly along Queens Boulevard, where you tend to see more of these large institutional buildings, the old Ridgewood Savings Bank, I think it was called the Trilon Theater on Queens Boulevard. Whole of the program we could do about that. So let's see what else. A lot of props there. What about the Walker Tower on 18th Street? Yes, so that's one of those Ralph Walker, formerly telephone buildings, that's been converted into residences and then had an addition added to it. So about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, Ralph Walker seemed to come into great vogue and fashion. And a lot of these old telephone buildings of his were converted, at least in part, to residential use, at least on the upper floors where they get more narrow. The lower floors where the floor plates are really too big to be able to carve residences out of them typically stayed for commercial uses. What about the poor Chrysler building? Someone asked. Well, it's still there. I know it's facing some issues. For what it's worth, I can tell you while it's not experiencing its best moment right now. I think many people know there's been quite a bit of criticism about the condition that the current owners have kept it in. I can remember in the 1970s when the building was in much worse condition than it is now. That's not an excuse for the current condition, but it's survived worse periods, and I am confident that it will do so again. Were any academic structures like schoolhouses, libraries, or university structures done in the Deco style? Yes. And again, if we were going to have a presentation that really covered the entire expanse of Art Deco, even just in New York, it wouldn't be an hour and a half. It would be 10 and a half hours at least. There's some really wonderful Art Deco schools in New York, quite a few in the Bronx. Particularly in the South Bronx, and there's others as well. I mentioned the Beaux-Arts Institute on 44th Street next to the Beaux-Arts apartment. That's, sort of not quite a school, but a sort of learning institution in the Art Deco style. So definitely, if you're interested in finding out more, there's much more out there. Somebody mentioned the Dime Savings Bank in Brooklyn, not Art Deco, more of a neoclassical building, but now serves as a lobby for a huge building behind it. I'm interested in drawing in Art Deco, especially flattening the perspective. Is there a reference or a class on how to do that if I had a photo of something? That's a very good question. I don't know the answer. But as you've identified, and as I mentioned before, one of the distinctive things about Art Deco is that it eschews the sort of traditional Western perspectival arrangement, and it's really more representational, inspired by Cubism. So instead of there being a single point perspective, it's generally more like there's a multi-point perspective. Aside from growing up in New York City, what grew you to be so interested in Art Deco? I think really just the fact that it's so incredibly beautiful and exciting. Like I said, because my parents, I think, imbued me with an interest in it. It took them virtually their entire lives to work their way up to being able to live in an Art Deco apartment building on the Grand Concourse, but they were only there for 2 or 3 years before they left. And I think they always sort of missed what they left behind. But even if I didn't have that background, I mean, there's just so many amazing Art Deco buildings in New York. Oh, somebody did in fact mention what is an Egyptian-inspired Art Deco building in New York. Thank you. It's one I'm familiar with, but it didn't occur to me, which is the Pythian Temple on the Upper West Side. I believe it's on either 71st or 73rd Street. I know it's just off 72nd Street, and it's a really, really, really striking Art Deco building with sort of crazy colors and very Egyptian inspired. And then let's see, we see a lot of the architects were inspired by non-Western styles. A lot of the ones you mentioned drew from Mayan and Aztec sources. Do you have any thoughts about why? Yes. The reason first of all, I think that at the time you saw in a lot of Western art and architecture a greater openness to looking at non-Western architecture and what might have at the time been called primitive art or architecture. But the other thing was that Mayan and Aztec architecture did that flattened perspective that the architects at the time were so interested in and so riveted by. And I believe or suspect that it was a combination of aesthetics and practicality. As the interwar years were moving on, and we certainly saw this move much more dramatically in the post-war years, construction was getting boxier, more geometric, simpler because it was cheaper. Sort of handmade artisan work was becoming more expensive. It was also, the Depression, things like that. So finding ways to take simple geometric boxy forms and make them visually interesting, I think was at a premium. And whether it was Mayan or Aztec influences, that was a way of doing that, of adding this visual interest, this implication of depth, without there having to actually be a full third dimension to make these buildings look interesting. I think some of it, they just thought it was aesthetically and intellectually stimulating, but some of it was that it was actually easier to do it that way. All right, we are at 7:30. There's lots more questions here that I could get to, but I am going to end it the Q&A there. I want to again thank everybody so much for participating, including our co-sponsors, East Village Community Coalition, Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, Art Deco Society of New York. William, if you can, please drop their links in the chat again. And I also just want to make a pitch to explore our Art Deco map, which so much of this information comes from. William, I'll ask you to drop that link in the chat as well, so that you can continue to explore this in greater depth. And then last but not least, I just want to encourage everybody to support village preservation, or just get on our email list, or go to our website and check out some of our other upcoming programs or past programs like this one. They are all recorded, so you can watch them. Hundreds of programs if you missed them. William, please drop that link to our website and donate page into the chat. And William, if you could leave that up for a little while, even after we wrap, so that people can still get it. But thank you everybody so much for your participation tonight. This has been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you feel like you know a little bit more about Art Deco, particularly in the neighborhoods of Greenwich Village and the East Village. Have a wonderful evening, and wherever you are, I hope your air conditioning is working well. Have a good night, everybody.